Welcome to Neat Lightroom Tricks Part 3 on bringing out more detail in our images, increasing the contrast in an image, and bringing out more color in the image are two of the things that really can make our images pop. And Lightroom has quite a few ways that we can do that. This is a picture that I took in Thailand in January, and what I was looking at was a sunset and the sky was predominantly blue. I was photographing on manual mode and using the spot meter, and I used a trick taught to me by my friend Canon Explorer of Light Chaz Glatzer, and that is to meter 3 fingers off the sun, which means that my bottom finger is going to be right at the top of the sun, and I'm going to meter up here over the top of my third finger. And we know that since we're using a reflective light meter, that all reflective light meters assume whatever it is on which we're metering is an average brightness, and it gives us an exposure to make it an average brightness. So this is the image that I got. Instead of a blue sky, I got sort of a gray sky. And when I looked at the image on the back of my camera, the sun was of course burned out. But we have to remember, when we look on the back of our camera, we're looking at a JPEG thumbnail of the image, even though this was a raw file. And JPEGs have a very small color gamut, either sRGB or Adobe RGB, depending on what you have your camera set to. But since this is a raw file and I'm using Lightroom, there is no color space in a raw file, and the native color space in Lightroom is the ProPhoto RGB, the largest color space, closest to what our eye can see. I know there's going to be a lot more detail in this picture. So to bring out that detail, I'm going to open the basic panel, and I'm going to start in the presence sliders. And the first thing I'm going to do is add some clarity to the picture. And so I'll just take this up to about 50, and then I'll take the dehaze slider to the right, and you'll see that the color starts to come back into the picture. The next thing I can do is simply go down to the HSL panel, and I'm going to use the targeted adjustment cursor for the saturation, and I'm going to just click and bring up more detail and more color in the picture. I can also make the blues more saturated, and if I wanted to, I can get the luminance slider and bring the sky darker. So here's my picture just using a couple of sliders. Then let's blow the picture up higher. So here's my final image. Here's the before and after, and you can see that it's a much nicer image of the sun. Another situation where this type of technique can be helpful is in a situation where we're photographing a fairly dark subject against a lighter background, and we have to slow down our shutter speed to get more detail in the dark subject. So the first thing I would do would be to take this again to the basic panel, and I would increase the clarity, and I usually start at about 50 just to bring out a little bit more detail. If you want to see the difference, press the backslash key and you'll see how much difference the clarity makes. And then I could also add a little bit of texture here, which will hopefully give a little more detail into the bird's wings. But now what I want to do is I want to bring out the more blue sky. I know the blue sky is there because I saw it when I photographed it. So we'll again go to the HSL panel, select the targeted adjustment cursor for saturation. I'll put it over what I think is the blue sky, and I'll move it up, which will bring back some of the detail in the blue sky. And then I'll get the luminance targeted adjustment cursor and do the same thing, and by dragging it down, I'm going to darken that blue sky. So here's the difference in the two pictures with just using the presence sliders in the basic panel and the HSL panel. And of course then we would go on to sharpen the picture. Another situation where this technique can be very helpful is where we're photographing a very light subject, such as this white bird, against a darker background. We know to get the white bird white, we have to let in a whole lot more light. Usually we spot meter off the brightest part of the white bird and then open up 1 2/3 or 2 stops to the positive with our shutter speed, which will give us a white bird. If we were to simply meter on the white bird and zero out our meter, we're going to end up a gray bird. So in this case, we've let in about 4 times the amount of light we would normally let in, and when we do that, we lose contrast in the image and the lighter colors start to disappear. So the first place I would start would be in the tone curve panel, and I'd get into the parametric curve where I have these 4 sliders here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make the darks just a little bit darker to add just a little more contrast to the image. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the point curve and I'm going to select the blue channel and just boost the blue channel just slightly. Then I'll go to the HSL panel, get the targeted adjustment cursor, and I'll go over to the water and drag up, and you can see I'm bringing back some of the blue in the water and then getting the luminance targeted adjustment cursor dragged down in the blue, and you can see that not only am I bringing back the blue in the water, I've got some of the reflection of the sky. So now I have a nice white bird against a much darker background, much more contrasty background. Here's the before and after, and you can see that I like the picture with the blue water and the white bird against the dark background better than I like this picture, which seems to be a little bit washed out. If we're interested in just increasing the contrast in our image, there are several ways we can do that in Lightroom. If we were to use the contrast slider in the basic panel, you can see that all that does by moving the slider to the right is it spreads out the histogram, and it makes the darks darker and the lights lighter, which isn't always what we want. A better way to do it would be to go to the HSL panel and select the luminance targeted adjustment cursor, and if we put it up here in the back, we can drag down and it's going to give us a little more detail in the back. If we also wanted to increase this area here, increase the contrast there, you can see that we've created a lot more contrast in the image simply by using the luminance adjustment slider. And if I go back a couple of steps and you watch the histogram when I do that, you'll see that most of the changes are going to be in the midtones. It's not going to spread out the histogram at all. This will also work in a situation where our subject is fairly light and we don't want to change the exposure on our subject, but we'd like to darken the background just a little bit to set the subject off a little bit. So if we get the luminance targeted adjustment cursor and put it in the background and drag it down, you can see that we're darkening the background, but we're not affecting the subject at all. And you can see when I do that, if you look at the histogram, the only thing that's really being changed is the darkness in the midtones. Another nice thing about the targeted adjustment cursor is it depends on where you put your cursor as to what tones are going to be affected, because only the tones underneath the cursor will be affected when I click and drag down. If I want to darken this lion a little bit, if I click and drag down, I can darken him that way. I can even bring out a little bit more red in his mane. But if you look at the histogram, when I do that, very little change is being made in the histogram because it's only these colors that are underneath the cursor that are being affected. I'm going to reset this image because I think there's an even better way to add contrast to the image, and that is to go to the tone curve panel and make sure that you're in the parametric curve. And a lot of times we don't want to make the image much brighter, but we'd like to have more contrast, and the way to do that is to just take the dark slider and slide it to the left, which will increase the contrast in the image, and along with the slider we'll end up with an image that has got much more contrast in it just by making those two changes in the darks and shadow sliders in the tone curve panel. Well, the saturation and luminance sections of the HSL panel are pretty good at changing the saturation and increasing the contrast in the picture. The hue section doesn't really let us do much to change the different colors in the picture. However, since our cameras record the 3 channels, red, green, and blue, and we have access to those 3 channels in the tone curve panel, then there's quite a bit we can do to change colors there. For example, here's a pink flower, and if we select just the red channel, get our targeted adjustment cursor, and then put it in the pink and drag it down, we're going to get a blue flower. We could then take the image into the HSL panel and we can increase the saturation with the targeted adjustment cursor, and we can even increase the contrast or make the flower darker. And that's a pretty big color change from the original pink color of the flower. If I were to then go back to the tone curve panel and this time select the green channel and do the same thing, remove the green from the flower, you can see I'm getting a much darker blue flower. And if I go back to the HSL panel, I could even make it darker by taking the luminance slider down, or I could take the luminance slider up and brighten the blue flower a little bit. But you notice when I'm doing this, I'm also darkening the background, and that's not always what we want to do. So there is another way that we can change the colors in the flower without having any effect on the background. And that way would be done by opening the adjustment brush up here in the toolbar underneath the histogram, and we'll turn on the overlay mask and not load the brush with any effects, because I just want to make sure that I get the effect only where I want it. If I load the brush with a bunch of effects and I don't like the result, I'm not going to know which effect it was that I loaded the brush with that produced the bad result. So once I've got the effect distributed exactly where I want it, I'll turn off the overlay mask, that's the O key, and I'll come down here and take the saturation slider all the way to the left. I've taken the saturation out of most of the flower, so what I want to do now is get a new brush, and this time I'll turn on the overlay mask again, and I'll repaint the flower exactly the way I did it before. And once I've got it, the effect placed exactly where I want it, what I'll do is I will turn off the overlay mask, and I'll take the color picker box here, and let's say I wanted a green flower. I just have to click on the green and the flower turns green. I could then add some clarity and maybe a little bit of dehaze, and then take the exposure down if I want the green a little bit darker. And if I decide I don't like the green flower, I'll go back to the color picker box. This time I'll pick blue, and the flower will turn blue. If I don't like that, I'll go back to the color picker box and pick red, and until I get exactly the color red that I want. So if you'll notice, I haven't done anything to the background. I've just changed the color of the flower. So there's an awful lot you can do in Lightroom to change the contrast, brightness, and colors in your images, and it's all in my book Lightroom Classic Made Easy, which is version 9 and is available at Amazon.com in both the hard copy and the Kindle version. And again, thanks very much for watching.